It's you silly machine. Thank you. Okay, hello. So you've all got, thank you very much for coming to watch me. I'm just going to do a quick rehearsal ready for Wednesday. The scenario is Big Nasty Pharmaceutical Company Limited. And I've got all my artifacts here. You should be able to find them all on the webpage as well. And I'm going to kick off. So 45 minutes starts now. So this is a pharmaceutical company which represents a leading manufacturer of prescription and over-the-counter drugs. And the scope of our particular implementation is to surround the management of clinical trials and product development. They already have Salesforce within 3 different regions. We have the US, we have EMEA, we have Asia Pacific, Japan. And within those regions, we're going to, they each have Sales Cloud implemented. So the scope of this particular initiative is to roll out clinical trial management and product development into the USA. Now, for this particular purpose, my recommended org strategy is to go multi-org, and my reason for that is because there are very different sales processes and very different product development processes. Therefore, we're going to implement into a US-centric org. That means that because we'll be handling patients, drugs, and trial results, and there is also a need for the org to be managed within English and Spanish languages. Therefore, it'll be multi-org. I assume it will be multi-currency as well, given the fact that we're implementing in Spanish as well. And we'll use the translation workbench to implement a separate translation process for our Spanish-speaking users. Moving on to the actors and licenses then. The actors I've identified are clinical researchers. These will be internal users, and they will require a Salesforce platform license because they'll be working with custom objects primarily. They will also work with accounts and contacts. In terms of external agents, we have a number of different agencies who support the pharmaceutical company in terms of managing clinical trials. So they will require community access to Salesforce, and I intend to position customer community plus licenses so that they can make use of the role hierarchy and sharing requirements that come with that particular role. We also have their managers, so managers at each local agency will also require customer community plus licenses so that they can access the whole data for each individual agency via the role hierarchy. We then have our clinical trial managers. These are internal users, and they require Salesforce Service Cloud licenses because they need to make use of cases and the assignment rules and entitlements that go with the management of cases. We also have supervisors of those clinical trial managers. That's specifically called out in the process. Therefore, they will need identical licenses, Salesforce Service Cloud. We then have our SVPs. These are internal users. They require access to Salesforce Service Cloud as well, primarily so that they can manage and act as an escalation point and collaborate with the various team members within their organization. Finally, we have our patients. Our patients are external customer community users who need access to log cases and access to custom objects that relate to their individual account and contact records. Moving on to the system landscape. The landscape that we have at the moment is quite varied. We intend to replace some of the functionality of an existing on-premise system called My Trial Manager. We will be replacing the clinical trial management capabilities of that system, but we will be making sure that we keep the proprietary rules engine that is currently in place within this system at the moment. Therefore, we're not retiring that system, we're just repurposing it. This system supports SOAP API capabilities, and we are going to use it, we have some flexibility in changing the web-based UI as well, which is really good. Looking to the right, and just starting here with my on-premise systems, I assume we have an on-premise data warehouse, which we can communicate with via means of a ESB, which is going to be used to handle all of the integrations between both My Trial Manager and Data Warehouse as well. Finally, we have an Active Directory identity store, which is being used to record staff credentials. We also have an LDAP store, which is currently being used to support agents. I intend to use an identity provider service, which is cloud-based, called Okta. Okta will enable the provisioning and deprovisioning of users from both stores, identity stores, but will also enable single sign-on to take place directly, and therefore streamlining the way that our users can log in. Moving up into the cloud, then we have three external systems that we intend to integrate with. All three support the REST API. So we have Smart Dose Applicator, which is a device that patients use to apply to give themselves doses of medicine during clinical trials. That has a REST capability and supports web connectivity over the internet, and wireless networks. So we will be able to collect dosage information using this device. We then have MedWatch and Sentinel. These are public-facing websites that effectively record issues with any drugs that have been released to the market, and we intend to integrate with those so that we can we can add an additional dimension to our clinical trial data. Obviously, there are other external systems as well. I'm going to come on to Salesforce in just a moment, but I recommend that we position a native mobile app in order to address the requirement for patients to be able to record their dosage and manage their patient profile in a highly customized way, including uploading videos and other files. So we intend to provision a native app, one for iOS and one for Android. We then have, similarly, an additional need for patients to log in via social sign-on through Facebook and Google. I intend to use the OpenID Connect, set up 2 authorization providers within Salesforce, and produce registration handlers for each of those providers in order to handle the provisioning of users. And that will we can therefore use my domain to expose those 2 methods of login to the customer community that we intend to position. Moving on to Salesforce, then we have our customer community. We then are setting up my domain. We're going to create connected apps in order to connect to my trial manager and the data warehouse. We will also, there's a requirement for users to be able to access, only Salesforce users to be able to access my trial manager. So we'll do that by means of a deep link, which we'll create in Salesforce, and that will log in using SAML from a ADP initiated login in order to access my trial manager. Sorry, SP initiated login in order to access my trial manager. We then have reports, standard reports and dashboards. We have an approval process. We have workflow and process builder. We have Canvas apps, which will be used to expose the data warehouse into Salesforce so that those users can look for a pool of resources. We have Salesforce Connect in order to enable access to dosage data from the data warehouse. We have Sales Cloud, we have Service Cloud, custom objects, and we have Conga in order for the generation of documents. Okay, so moving on to the role hierarchy, which has gone. Okay, so the way I position my role hierarchy is that we will have, oh my God, I haven't done it. I'm going to have to come back to that. Too stressed. Moving on to our data model. So our data model consists of a number of standard and custom objects. So just to give you a key, all the volumes that I'm quoting here are volumes within 1 year. Our standard objects are represented by circles, our custom objects are represented by squares, and our external objects are represented using a triangle. So I'll start with the very beginning, which is our accounts. So accounts will represent patients as person accounts, and there will be a second record type to represent agencies. Related to accounts, we have contacts. These contacts will represent agents, but equally there will be a replicated contact for each patient as they're a person account as well. We then have cases, which is standard objects. These will be used to represent side effects as patients report them. And we also have a couple more standard objects. One is contact roles. Contact roles will be used to position the primary contact for each agency. And we'll also have users, which I need to link just to show the relationship between a clinical trial manager and any drugs that are produced. Okay. So that was quick. So moving on to our custom objects, we have quite a few, which is why I've made them all blocks. So related to contacts, we have our trial patients. These represent any patients that have taken part in a clinical trial. We also have the trials themselves are a custom object. These are the OWD is set to private, and they'll be owned by the clinical trial manager, and they represent a number of different clinical trials that can take place. We anticipate about 5,000 of those per year. Related to that, we have trial cohorts, and these are related to trials on a master detail relationship basis, because we need to, and they will be the visibility is controlled by parents, and we expect there to be 1 or 2 per trial. In terms of the trial patients themselves, these are related to both the trials and the trial cohorts. They're related via lookup for sharing reasons, because agents can't view patients, but they can view a cohort. So in order to keep the patient data safe and reliable, we don't want to accidentally grant access to the trial patients through master detail relationships and have it inherit the sharing there. So moving up to drugs. So drugs is where everything really starts, to be honest. So if any drug that is being worked on by a clinical researcher, really the drugs can only be visible to that researcher and the researcher's manager in the role hierarchy. Therefore, they will be the owner of the drug, and the drug's OWD will be set to private. And we expect there to be about 5,000 drugs per year. And within each drug, we anticipate there could be up to 50,000 compounds created in a year to represent the various different compounds that have been pulled into the drug to produce the medicine itself. I'll come back to that when I go through the requirements. Related to a trial, we have a primary clinical trial manager who is the owner of the trial, but equally we actually nominate a primary trial agent as well, and a primary agency that effectively supports the clinical trial. So these again are Community Plus users. So there will be a relationship between the trial agent, the primary trial, and the primary agent and the contact, as you can see here through lookup. And then we will also have a lookup from the account to the trial. On the trial back to the account that represents the primary agency as well that's supporting. However, there is an impact on the data model, because we need to make sure that we can show multiple different agents that support this particular trial. So we have relationships, junction objects called trial agents, and where is it? Where has it gone? We have, I think. No, just the trial agents, because the requirement is just to represent the various agents that are supporting this particular trial. We then have, sorry, 1 second. Okay. We then have a requirement to track patient diseases and medical history. So these are represented as individual objects. Medical history, I have made the assumption that medical history could represent an event, so somebody going to the doctors and something new being reported, or it could represent a diagnosis, any kind of treatment, etc., outside of the realms of the clinical trial. So that's represented in an object related to the contact via lookup. We then also have patient diseases and diseases. The reason I've split these out is because it's actually to give business value to the researchers, because if they're looking at an individual disease, they should be able to see which patients have been affected by that disease, and it should help them to identify any potential candidates for future trials, as well as the information that's being exposed to them through the data warehouse. So it's just an added value element there. And then finally, we have our external object. We have our trial results. This is a custom object that is related to the trial itself, because we need to be able to track the outcome of an individual trial. So that helps them to record that outcome, and also enables them to make it anonymized so that the information can be shared with agencies. We then also have, finally, a very large data volume risk here. So we have an external object that is coming from the data warehouse, and that we anticipate about 25 million records in a given year. And this is the smart dose data. So as each person administers a dosage, it will actually, there's a record that's created for the trial which says this is when the dose is scheduled, and therefore we'll expose that through the mobile app to the patients. but it also enables us to analyze and notify, enables the business to take action if a patient is late administering their dose. So because of the large volumes involved, and because of the fact that we have flexibility to modify that data warehouse as per the system landscape, I recommend using using external object, which is related to trial patients by external lookup field. Okay. So moving on to data model, identity. So we have an identity management requirement, which I can refer to on page 5. So clinical, okay, so the requirement, I've already addressed the requirement for external agents and internal staff being automatically provisioned and deprovisioned from AD and LDAP. That's being used, we're using Okta for that. Patients register and authenticate to customer portal. We're using social sign-on, as I've reflected there. And seamless login is required between Salesforce and My Trial Manager, and users of My Trial Manager must be active users of Salesforce. We'll use SSO with SAML, where Salesforce is the identity provider, and we'll provide a link in Salesforce to the and because the user's already authenticated through Active Directory or Okta, actually we'll provide a link in Salesforce so that they can click it and access the other system, with callbacks going back to Okta as the identity provider. Okay, that's identity. So looking at security then, I just want to take your attention to page 5, which is the accessibility requirements. So, and I'm very, very aware that I've not drawn out my role hierarchy, so I'm going to do that for you now. And apologies that you're not able to see that. It's because I did it the other day and I forgot to do it again. I got too stressed. Okay, so we have our, so at the bottom of the hierarchy, we've got our researchers. And the researchers need to be able to own drugs, as I've mentioned before, and then managers as well. So there'll be for each area. So there's 3 different areas, or I've assumed there are 3 different areas. So there's psychoactive drugs, and there's 2 other types as well. It just say in the scenario, etc. So I assume. So for each individual department, there'll be clinical researchers and there'll be clinical research managers. Who are sitting above them in the hierarchy here. We will then have, and this is to enable the sharing of that data. We then, because we have customer community plus users, these who represent the agents, we will have an external agent role, and we'll have an external agent manager, agency manager. And these are these are managed by the clinical trial managers. So they will roll up to them in the role hierarchy. And then we have our SVPs for each area. So SVP of research, SVP of research trials. We have an SVP of research, where the CRMs, where the clinical research managers report into the SVP. And yeah, okay, that's fine. Okay, so addressing security requirements then, we have clinical trial managers only have visibility to drugs after development phase. This will be managed by Apex sharing, because clinical trial managers are actually only added via lookup to drugs. So you see here, I have this relationship, users to drugs, clinical trial manager. Because it's a lookup field, I'm going to use Apex sharing in order to ensure that when that field is updated, there is an entry created in the share table for the drugs object, which is set to private. Internal agents and users have visibility to patients, but only clinical trial managers can edit them. What that means is that internal users. So what that means is that all patients themselves, so as contacts, these are public read only. And then we'll have a sharing rule that will enable clinical trial managers and agents to edit that information. And we'll also enable external sharing to enable I assume that patients need to manage their own profiles and their own data as well. Therefore, I will enable external sharing to ensure that contacts can only update their own data. Patients view only their information in the trial they're assigned to. So what that means is because patients don't have roles, we will enable the sharing set that will share the trial patient records. That's this record here. That will be shared via sharing set to the patient, because the patient will be there as a contact against an account, and therefore the sharing set can be configured to share items that are related to those, and it's a custom object too. Patients can only view side effects they've raised themselves. That's cases. That's standard. As community users, they'll be able to raise a case. We'll expose that through the mobile app as well, using the mobile SDK. Clinical researchers only see aggregated information for trials. So what that means is your clinical researchers will not be owning trials, and they'll be private. So there will be a sharing role set up to enable trials for drugs within their area to be we'll enable them to see, we won't allow them to see the patients, but we'll enable them to see the trial cohorts. And because this relationship is master detail, if they can see the trials, they can see the cohorts anyway. That will contain roll-up numbers of patients and summarized data about the patients. And because the trial patients are related via lookup, they won't be able to see the patients, and we'll take them off the page layout for the clinical researchers as well. Okay, so that's the accessibility and security. So finally, I'm going to go straight into the requirements now. So looking at page 1, 2. So looking at the bottom of page 2, to be processes. Clinical researchers perform the initial discovery of new drugs through a two-stage process. We're going to replace the spreadsheets and email process, and we are going to enable them to create new drugs records in Salesforce. And what that will enable them to do is to then take it through. We'll enable path in Lightning as well, so they can track the stage of development for the drugs. If there's any additional experiments that take place, those can be logged as tasks, and they can use chat. We'll enable chatter so they can record the experiment and the outcome. Clinical research is split into teams. Reporting rolls up to a head of clinical research. I've represented that on my. I'll represent on that clinical research head, and then rolling up into the SVP. Okay, Okay, once development's completed, we'll set an approval process, and the users will have to designate a clinical trial manager. So as soon as the record is approved, there'll be a notification to the lead researcher and clinical trial manager. So that will be handled using Process Builder. Drugs and compound relationships mastered in Salesforce, synchronized to my trial manager. So looking at integrations 1 and 1A. So what we're going to do to orchestrate that is there will be an outbound message sent to the middleware, which is our ESB. And the middleware, and it will just send the drug ID. The middleware will then receive that message and then call back into Salesforce. So we'll send the ID of the drug out to the middleware. The middleware will then use that drug ID, call back into Salesforce, do a remote call-in to get the results of a SQL query using the drug ID that will actually take the information about the drugs and any related compound relationships as well, and send them into back into the middleware and send it out to our trial manager. Designing a clinical trial, we can create several different trials. When we create a pool of potential candidates, we'll have a status of trial patients, so it will either be potential or actual. When the agency is assigned, there'll be a validation rule, so we'll have lookup fields for the agent and the agency contact. If they're not completed, if they're completed and the minimum recruit size or recommended cohort isn't specified, we'll have a validation rule that runs. Additional agents can be assigned, that's fine, that's in the data model. We use files for storing non-disclosure agreements. We'll also have a time-based workflow and process builder, which means that if agencies aren't specified within 7 days, so every time we create a trial record, each trial record will go into the workflow queue, and until the agency record is updated, it'll be in the queue to receive a notification to say you need to do this. And obviously once they've filled that in, the record will drop out the workflow queue. so they won't get a notification. Only designated agents and agency managers can view the trial. That'll be done using Apex sharing. Assigning additional other internal managers. There's a Salesforce Labs app that we can use in Lightning at the moment to enable manual sharing, so they can add through that. We'll use Chatter to collaborate with for agents to collaborate with the trial manager and the patients. With the trial manager. Patients sourced from the internal data warehouse will help create integration number 2. This is going to be a UI integration with the data warehouse via a Canvas app that sits behind a Visualforce page, and they'll access that through a tab. Disease history synchronized in near real time to data warehouse and trial manager. Again, using this this come and get me approach. So there'll be if you look at integrations 3 and 3A, so the first one will be an outbound message to the ESB with a patient ID, and then the ESB will call back into Salesforce to get the results for SQL query using the patient ID to get information about the disease and the medical history, as you can see, is related to the contact and the data model. Before the trial process can commence, we have to allocate. So what we'll do is create a Lightning component with an Apex controller class behind it, and we'll put some validation into that class that prevents patients must meet. That ensures that if they try to add any more than 2,000 patients, it will prevent them from doing that. The same controller in Visualforce, the same Apex controller will then produce run a random selection from the pool of patients and actually produce update the trial patient status from being potential to being actual, and at the same time assign a placebo. So there's a second random. There's a second routine that runs to randomly assign either the drug that's related to the trial or a placebo to the actual and update the lookup field on the trial patient so that you can see what they've been actually allocated for the trial. The agent can't see that, can't see if the drug was assigned or not, so that's fine. We'll use field level security for that. Looking at page 4, agents can't view the names of the candidates selected, but they can view the trial cohort. I addressed that earlier. Patients can view files and short videos in the mobile app. So that's files shared through a Lightning component that's exposed through the mobile app. We'll also use an external object for the dosage. We will use any side effect. They'll log a case. Any photos they can upload against their patient trial record, that's standard. They can use file upload for that, which will expose through mobile SDK. Marking priority is done for using the standard case field for priority. We'll have an assignment rule that assigns cases to a clinical trial manager with immediate notification. If there's a higher severity, then there's a need to contact the patient. So we'll use an escalation rule. We'll use Process Builder, which will assign the case and chat to the case owner if it's a severe side effect. We'll have an escalation rule. If a critical side effect is not reviewed within 8 hours, we'll alert a supervisor. What we'll do then is track a side effect through different stages. That's managed through the standard case status field. We then have if patients haven't taken their dose within a 2-hour window. So let's look at integration number 4. So we have a late dosage alert from the data warehouse into Salesforce using remote call-in. There'll be, and what that will do is create a new chatter post to update the agent to say that they need to update the patient. That will cause a push notification to go to the patient through their mobile app. So we'll make use of that. Agent needs to mark that the follow-up has completed if they've missed a dose by more than a day. So this is integration number 5. There will be a remote call-in from the data warehouse to Salesforce to create a task for the trial manager to actually follow up with that case. So that trial manager, obviously the case is going to be related to the trial. No, it's not. I'll have to create a new lookup field there so that we can find the right trial manager and assign the task. Okay, trials not completed within 30 days, assigned to a pool for follow-up. So we'll enable queue ownership on the custom field, on the custom object for trial. So the notes and activities will be enabled, which will enable us to create a queue for the trial, and then we'll have a queue for the clinical trial managers for follow-up. So we'll manage that using Process Builder. Agents working with patients to determine the trial results and enter it for analysis and review. So filtering by various field values, supporting multi-record types, will create a Lightning component for that. Trial results, and so looking at trial results, the clinical research will use my trial manager to calculate recommendations. So we can't actually, there's no API provided for this, and the user can't leave Salesforce. Therefore, we'll create a second Canvas app, which is sitting behind a Visualforce page, and enables them to actually, it enables us to pass, the Visualforce Apex controller will enable us to pass data about the trial results into the Canvas app, and therefore instigate the rules engine to happen directly within the trial manager. When the FDA approval, what we'll do is create a form. We'll use Conga, as I've recommended on my system landscape. Conga will be used to produce a pre-formatted document for the FDA to send off for approval. And when it's approved, there'll be a custom field on the trial, on the drug itself, which will kick off a process builder to create a new product, which can therefore be used in Sales Cloud and priced accordingly later. I assume that the pricing is handled in the Sales Cloud Center of Excellence. Therefore, that's a job that needs to be done afterwards. So any reports with problems with drugs, we get those from MedWatch and Sentinel. So again, this is to do with my integration, but never mind. So external data sources, MedWatch and Sentinel. I'm going to put that data into, because there's over 1 million. I'm going to actually have those being called out. I'm going to have those calling into my ESB, and then I'm going to have my ESB send that data down to the data warehouse, so that it can then be referred to later on. And I'll create a Canvas app to expose that part of the data warehouse so that they can actually see those warnings. Okay, we're at 30 minutes. Good. Okay, data requirements. So I already covered that in the object. So in the object model. So clinical researchers viewing a report of drugs and stages of development is a standard report. We'll put on trials under design and candidates associated. So we'll also produce a report. Dosage history can be exposed to patients. Obviously, it's calling out to our data warehouse. So what I want to do there is actually produce a Lightning component with an Apex controller with sharing, which should enable the external users to view only their own patient dosage history. We'll then create a standard report for trial information to determine if the FDA submission should progress. I assume that the decision is made manually by a human being, therefore we don't need to create any kind of automation to recommend that. Okay, so let's look at my project and governance model here. So we have a global CIO who's looking to ensure that the best practices are followed. So what we have at the moment is this real desire to be innovative as a company. That comes with a lot of pros and cons, really, because we obviously want to keep an innovative culture across all subsidiaries, and with the pharmaceuticals industry, it's heavily regulated in each individual country, so you can't impose a single process on all of them. So we're going to have 3 orgs, and this is only going to concern the US org. Each subsidiary has SVPs of clinical research, trials, and IT. They've previously made all the decisions, but what has actually also happened is the clinical research SVP has been allowed to complete projects under the radar. She's got quite a large budget. So what I intend to do is, because also all the development is actually done offshore, and IT basically treats it as a black box. We don't know what happens inside the box. And there's a production bug count that's noticeably higher. So that indicates to me there's a lot of insufficient testing going on. Therefore, we need to have a very a structured process that actually allows for the innovation to take place across the streams. So I've actually identified that there are potentially 2 main streams going on here. So we have our trials and we have drug research. I would actually recommend that we have product owners for each of those 2 sections, and that enables the clinical research to focus all of her budget on the clinical trials and act as an executive sponsor for that particular work stream. And I would expect that each SVP should sponsor and fund each of those work streams, with the global CIO acting as the accountable party whenever they're asked about this initiative. Outside of the mission critical systems, so mission critical systems are basically my trial manager and smart dose. So because they're mission critical, we can only really update them once or twice a year, and we have to, and they need extensive, anything that we interface with these systems need extensive validation. Canvas apps shouldn't be a risk necessarily because we're not actually changing anything on the other side. We're just exposing it into Salesforce. But any our interactions with my trial manager, not trail manager, I'm obsessed. These are going to be these integrations will need to be carefully planned in to make sure. So the risk of that is that obviously is that our users can't necessarily get. Actually, there isn't really a risk of that because Salesforce is the master now, so there isn't really a risk. Anyway, but one thing we can see is that obviously there is a risk in that the organisation wants to increase in technology innovation and encourage all teams to spend part of their working day brainstorming. To me, the risk of that is you get an awful lot of ideas coming in, and a huge backlog of ideas, and some of them, obviously, if we are breaking it into trials and drug research, some of those areas cross over each other. So we have to make sure that we can nominate a product owner for those critical areas. We need to make sure we're tracking all our ideas and retaining them. So I recommend we use Jira and create epics in Jira, and each of the product managers are responsible for owning the process of refining the backlogs. Even if they nominate an individual product owner within their own teams who's a bit lower down and on the ground, they can actually take part in ride-alongs with users and come up with a backlog that's user-centric to ensure success. And obviously make sure if there's any duplicating ideas, they're merged together. If we're accepting any ideas on development, we need to trace it all the way through. So Jira will enable us to integrate with a version control and a CI tool to enable us to do that so that we can track. We want to release every month. So what I propose is an agile framework for developing our ideas, because of the fact that things will change so much and because we need to release monthly. So we need to make sure that we're shipping regularly. So the significant risks that I've identified is that there's no partnership with the business and the development and the developers. It's offshore and it's black box. We need to increase that partnership by nominating product owners. We need a steering committee that will keep our executive sponsors in line and make sure that they're utilising their budget more effectively. We have a large backlog of ideas. We have departments innovating in isolation because obviously there must be a reason that our clinical research SVP has been doing her own thing. So what we need to try and do is actually encourage other departments to follow her lead, really. We need to release monthly. I assume that means we actually have a fairly messy architecture outside of what we know about. So we need to take that into consideration and involve the other members of IT just in making them aware. So we need to communicate regularly. We have ideas and shifting requirements. We have potential communication issues. We have insufficient testing, and there's a political landscape to navigate as well. So we have to be quite careful. So my strategies are: I think we need an MDM, so Master Data Management process. We know Salesforce is the master for trials and research. We need to make sure that we understand and nominate the other systems and what they are masters for. So, for example, my trial manager we know is going to be master for the rules engine and the trial results. So that should influence how we train our users to use Salesforce. We want monthly releases, so that's Agile Framework will help us to do that. We have Jira and version control and CI tools, product owners, and CIO executive sponsor. So the way that I propose to handle this is just looking at my development lifecycle diagram now. So within each work stream, I intend to split between 2 work streams, and within each work stream, in order to make sure that our developers can can be as innovative as they can be, they're each going to work in their own sandbox, and we'll use Git as a version control tool that will enable the developers to actually check in all of their changes from their local machine. So what will happen is the developers install their own IDE, they work on their code, they refresh down from Git every time there's a change, and they can work with a single version of the truth, which is the new Salesforce org. From Git, the process is to, and obviously at that point they're testing their own work and they're able to open up their work for peer review. So if they want to get someone to have a look at it and just share ideas. It increases the collaboration and innovation at that stage. Obviously, if there's any sorry, carry on. So then once they've done that, everybody will check in their changes, and there'll be a commit into the integrations branch within Git, and then pull that down into a developer pro sandbox. In that sandbox, the team can complete code reviews, they can complete regression tests, and also they can use a tool like Provar to set up automated tests that they can then run later on. So these are UI tests that they can complete. It also means they can document what they're doing, they can relate the tests and the acceptance criteria to their tickets in Jira, and in Jira they can track whether, at which stage each change has been put into. Then at that point, once it's passed code review, a release manager who will be nominated by the team. Ideally, I've seen it where the team is rotated, where the position is rotated, so each person in the team gets to be release manager. But that release manager needs to have development skills and have experience of working with Git and CI tools as well in order to orchestrate that release. Because once you release, once you start to integrate these things, there's a lot of errors, so it can be a bit of a full-time job. But we will basically refresh down into the UAT sandbox from Git, where we can then allow the business to come in and conduct UAT, user acceptance testing. Now that is a high-risk area, because obviously, and if you're working with business users, UAT can tend not to be prioritized. As a backup and a fail-safe, I would actually recommend creating some additional UAT automated tests in Provar to kind of support and replicate what the business users would be doing should we run into any bottlenecks later on with users not completing their testing on time. That's my backup plan. We then have as soon as if there's any changes coming out of UAT, those will be logged against the tickets in Jira. The developers and configurators can then make those changes in their own sandbox and then push them up and then commit into Git. Git can then we can then do refreshes into the SIT sandbox for and then run the regression tests again. And then back into the UAT sandbox, and then into the merge into the UAT sandbox, merge into the master branch to refresh down into UAT sandbox, so that we have that single version, or a feature branch, which is called UAT, and then refresh down into the sandbox. Enable users to replicate their tests, or rerun the rerun the UAT tests using Provar again. At that point, we need sign off from the business. So once the business has signed off UAT, they could be testing one feature, they could be testing a whole system end to end. In this particular instance, because it's innovative and we're constantly developing, I want them to be testing things like the drug research features in isolation. So we'll do it by not by epics but by stories, a collection of stories that come together to make a feature. Anyway, just help them. So by the time we've signed off UAT, it's actually ready to. We actually don't want many more changes. So at that point, we merge up into master branch, and then we do a pull request, and this is where I would recommend I assume the client's IT team would have some knowledge of this process, so they can actually check that pull request, they can approve it if they're happy with it, and then refresh into sandbox, into a full copy sandbox, which represents pre-production. At that point, we would complete our data migration, so all of the history for the last 6 months, medical history, patients, assume comes out of my trial manager. We will produce CSV files, which will then use the ETL capability of our MuleSoft and use that to update the full sandbox with data and test again, so we can run all our automated tests and check how it's performing with that volume of data. At that point, I also would want to, my UAT sandbox would be a partial copy as well, because they need a small subset of data, but it would be anonymized at this point, so I'd create some scripts to anonymize the data. We then also clone the sandbox, which is a new feature, to create a training sandbox for users to start being trained before we go live. for the first time. And then once we've actually performed our dress rehearsals on the data migration and any performance tests, if there's any changes, it will go through the process again. But then we'll create change sets to deploy all of our code and configuration metadata to the production environment. Once live, I'm aware I've not gone very long. Once we're live, at that point we will then also produce another partial copy sandbox, which is for full copy sandbox, which is for hot fixes. So if there's any emergency changes that need to go through, then our development team can make them in the hotfix sandbox, and then actually do commit those changes into Git and take it through the process again, so that we can regression test any new feature development against any hotfixes that we need to complete. And thus concludes my presentation.
Yay! Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. We did the timings.